Welcome back, everyone. So if you're just joining us, thank you so much for being here. So we're going to continue with the rest of the session, and this session is going to be looking at justice as fair discrimination. I'd like to welcome to the stage, starting off with Nondlandla Mugova. And then we have Akanimo Akpan and Edmund Terim. Please join us on stage. And they will also be taking questions at the end of the discussion. So welcome.
Good afternoon. I'm waiting for the presentation. Thank you. So, beyond technical accuracy and regulatory compliance, actuarial practice inevitably carries or calls us to think about the question of responsibility. What happens when the models that we produce are technically sound, yet produce outcomes that are discriminatory? Who should we hold responsible for this? That is the central question that we attempt to tease out in this conversation with you, and we hope that you come in with an open mind. So as we begin, I want to invite Nontlantla, to come in and say a word on how you should come into this conversation, particularly given the theme of this convention, which is to go beyond the numbers. And it feels like it's at the heart of our call. When we speak to actuaries, one person said to me, we are the darlings of numbers. We love numbers. So what does that mean for us as we enter into this conversation?
As we get into this conversation, I would like to just invite us, to open, I'd say also our hearts outside of our minds. Because most of the time when people talk about us, they usually box us into numbers, which is quite interesting, especially now in the age of large data sets and AI. Coming under fire with a lot of discrimination and all types of those things. So I would like us to just almost be open to look beyond the numbers. Also look beyond the law. And also broaden the public interest definition and interpretation to include arguing for justice as fair discrimination. So that's what I invite us to do, which is why it was quite interesting when I saw the theme for this year, Beyond the Numbers. Which was quite interesting and quite nice and very confirming for our paper.
So the full paper is contained. You can get it through this link, and I'm sure you have already seen it. But let me stay with you, Nontlantla. You are an actuary that collaborated with two philosophers, people working on the ethics and governance of AI, to write this paper. What was that process like for you?
So for me, Section 59 goes back to 2019 when it first, at least I saw it on the news, because at that time I was still writing my exam, my healthcare fellowship, so I read quite a bit on it and just started to deep dive and engage with it. But I must say I did find myself struggling a little bit because it was actually challenging us to look beyond the numbers, beyond all the fancy methodologies that we use in our modeling. So I found myself asking myself, what is really right here if I were to ignore the numbers? And I think I also realized that when this year the idea of writing a paper came about, but I was like, I don't think looking at it from, I think, a technical perspective is enough. I need to actually involve expertise from an ethics of AI perspective to hear what they can add in terms of what framework can we use to actually engage constructively on this debate. Because it really requires us to look a little bit deeper. And I think in the age of AI, large data sets, advanced algorithms, it's really asking us to dig a little bit deeper. And we've also seen that with the different societies across the continent. If you look at the UK, Australia, they're all starting to write some guidelines because this AI is complex and comes with a lot of risk we don't understand yet. And I think for me, it's calling us to who we are, which one of the things that I'm proud of being an actuary is our broader, I think how committed we are to the broader definition of public interest, which is why I think for me, when I thought of this paper, I said, I can't write it alone. I need someone who's an expert in the ethics of AI, which is when I invited Dr. Akpan and Dr. Uga to actually write this paper with me.
Thank you. And that's a good place to bring in Dr. Uga to sort of begin to tease out why this question of algorithm being racist, even though when it's designed to be neutral, it's a problematic framing. Why is this an important question that we are tackling?
I think this is an important question because for some reason it sounds like those two terminologies are contradictory. On the one hand, the algorithm is neutral, but on the other hand, the algorithm is racist. But then these are issues that are philosophically embedded. Prima facie, a neutral algorithm is not supposed to be racist. But as we're going to see as we journey through this presentation, first we're going to discuss the concept of neutrality. What does it mean for something to be neutral? And then we're going to add the concept of value-ladenness. What does it mean for something to be value neutral? And when we engage with this concept, only then can we then explore the impossibility for something, and especially an algorithm, which is a socio-technical system, to be neutral. But we're going to see as we progress along this presentation.
So to get us started, Nonhlanhla, what is the context that informed this inquiry? You mentioned earlier the Section 59 inquiry. Let's not assume that people know about it. Can you just tell us briefly what was that about?
Okay. So in 2019, there were black providers that basically accused medical schemes and their administrators of targeting them for the fraud, waste, and abuse investigations. It still is it's a very serious allegation, especially given the context of South Africa. Not long time ago, we were still in the apartheid era. And also, if you look at that allegation, if it's proven to be true, then it means those medical schemes and administrators would have violated the South African Constitution, Chapter 2, Section 9, which is very serious. So I think but then what happened with the inquiry, because this inquiry was being led by the CMS Council of Medical Schemes as they were acting on their regulatory mandate when those accusations came forth. And when they say, I think I need to just clarify in terms of the definition that was used in terms of black providers. So black providers actually included also Indians. So when the inquiry carried on for many years, the final report was only released this year in July. But what was interesting as I followed it over the years is that because it was being dealt with from a legal angle, and what usually happens when something is being dealt with from a legal angle is that it almost forces us on these opposite ends. It's either you are on the defense or you are the plaintiff. And that's exactly what happened with this Section 59 inquiry. People took sides. Either you were on the other side and kind of like fighting for your own side to prove your own innocence. And that did not create an environment where we can enter into a dialogue and say, actually, what is morally right? And so what this paper seeks to do is to go beyond the law and say, actually, as actuaries who center their work around the public interest, what was actually morally right in this case. And I think I just need to clarify before we go forward that there was no legal finding that those medical schemes or administrators were actually guilty. So that's very important to take forward. But I think what we seek to do with this paper is actually tease out the ethical conundrums that actually came out that are very much relevant for actuaries and the work that we do.
So I think that is a good place to be very clear what this is not about. We are not engaging in a legal analysis, to determine who was culpable. It's not a comprehensive review of the inquiry. It's not a technical, or critique on the technical development of the models, that the people used. And it's not, we are not offering any adjudication. So we are only attempting to engage in questions around ethics and morality, from a very conceptual point of view. And to do this, given that we don't have money, and this it's quite a hot topic, we have introduced an hypothetical case study that helps us to sort of distance ourselves from the hotness of this inquiry. So think about Jeremy. It's a made-up figure. It could be SIPO, Tabo, it doesn't really matter. But he was really tasked with building the models to determine this fraud, waste, and abuse. And he was assured that the models have been clean, the data is clean, and it was to optimize for predictive accuracy. His work was fair, objective, and unbiased. But despite all his efforts and his best intentions, it surfaced that his model produced unfair outcomes. Nonhlanhla, given the work that you do, how does this resonate for you? Does it feel like something that you could have sort of been implicated yourself had you worked on this?
Yes, actually, I must say, I must disclose, I'm a liker of things. And so definitely, if this model was in my company, I was going to be involved in it. But I think that aside, I really do see myself in Jeremy personally. And if I think about the actuaries that are my colleagues, my actuarial colleagues, I could see a lot of them in Jeremy, because we're all very dedicated. We are committed to objectivity. We're committed to equality, equity in our work, and we're committed to public interest. But despite all this, we need to recognize that we're working within limitations. And to assume that just because the data you've applied all the deep biasing kind of like methodologies into your data, you made sure everything is right, but is that really achievable, practically speaking? Because we are working with limitations. The moment that you take on data, it's already biased in some way. Whoever collected it, it's biased in some way. The way the questions are asked, again, brings in some bias. And also, as we know, when we do modeling, you put in a couple of assumptions in those models. Again, that is the bias that is being brought into your modeling. So I couldn't really separate myself from Jeremy. So it felt like what was happening to Jeremy could actually happen to me or any of my fellow actuaries that I work with. Mm-hmm. So I really could see myself in Jeremy.
So Jeremy, post this revelation of unfairness, advances 3 key arguments. One, he claims that the algorithm that he worked on was neutral. He followed an objective process, and there is no way that we can hold him accountable because he didn't really intend, or could foresee any harm. Dr. Uga, what are the ethical challenges with this sort of defenses?
I think the first problem is the issue of neutrality, and Jeremy coming from a perspective where he argues that his algorithm is neutral in vis-a-vis his technology is neutral. And I think that is a false assumption. So as a philosopher of technology, the concept of neutrality in technology is one of those concepts that has been engaged within the literature and the philosophy of technology. So first of all, from the conception of technology, so one of the French philosophers, Bernard Stiegler, would say that technology is the externalization of the consciousness of the designer. So what this means is that when you have a model, the model just replicates what is within your consciousness. Now, there is a distinction between technology as a technical artifact and technology as a socio-technical artifact. So technology as a technical artifact so philosophers like Don Ide, Philippe Bray, and the rest would argue that even as a technical artifact, technology is not value-free. And what does this mean? It means that technology, besides the fact that it replicates the consciousness of the designer, it also informs our action. And as we're going to see in the next slide, where we have 2 different technologies, a gun and a bridge, I'm going to explain how this distinction is actually made clear. And then I'm going to explain what a technical artifact is using that example, and what a socio-technical artifact is using the same example that we're going to see now.
Cool. And there are other arguments that, Jeremy, or ethical challenges that is embedded in Jeremy's defense. The question about objectivity, which is a prized value in actuarial practice. Again, in the subsequent sections of this presentation, we will try and tease out what we really mean by objectivity when we use it, and the culpability that comes with ignoring certain harm. So, I guess with that, takes us to the heart of Jeremy's defense, which is how can I be held responsible for something I didn't intend, couldn't see, and was never trained to prevent. So, Ntlantla, in your practice, I would imagine that this is one of the challenges that you face. When you have done everything by the books, you're sort of, your model is technically sound and procedurally compliant, yet people accuse you of maybe, this has caused harm. How does that land with you?
Definitely, it doesn't land well, right? And it's quite. I think a lot of us may actually in future find ourselves in this situation where harm has been done, but you didn't intend to. Because if you look at these models that we use, because gone are those days where I would say, I don't want to say simple, but kind of like you could explain your model quite comfortably. But now we are dealing with these very advanced algorithms where you know that the accuracy is really good, you test it, but it's very difficult to pinpoint exactly how you got to the final answer. And we saw that when we were following the Section 59 inquiry, in terms when you listen to the testimonies, in terms of how difficult it was for the owners of the models to actually explain how we actually got to the end, right? So I think if I look at where the world is going and also just the big data, and we're going to find ourselves in this situation where you didn't intend the harm, you didn't foresee it, but it's happening because most of us are engaging or using now large data sets, using and embracing AI in our modeling.
So let's move into unpacking these three arguments that Jeremy offered, beginning with the myth of neutrality. And neutrality seems to be a value that is really prized in the actuarial practice. And again, let me stay with you, Ntlantla. How does this sort of neutrality thesis show up in your profession?
So it was quite interesting when we started debating this when we were working on the paper, because then I thought it was going to be something quite easy for me to answer, or at least define or defend conceptually. But actually, it's an element that I struggled with, right? What I could pinpoint on is that we actually applied a lot. For example, if you think about, let me just take you back for some who wrote their exams a couple of years ago. You remember the importance of always having to balance the coin, look at both sides of the coin. That can be argued is actually neutrality. But is it defined anywhere? We couldn't find it in the actual literature where it's actually conceptually really defended, defined, argued on. So it's there in terms of the application, but we struggle to find it where it's really defined. But then I also looked at how we actually engage as actuaries. Like phrases like numbers are just numbers don't lie, equations can't discriminate. It's something that we do tend to hear if you work in the space or in actual profession, how we just, we almost like, we trust the numbers, we work with the numbers, we're comfortable with the numbers. Because even if I look at like the latest literature that we have in the actual profession on discrimination, including proxy discrimination, it's also very much grounded on the fact that we think we can actually solve it using the numbers that we have. We can actually de-bias the data, we can de-bias the models, we can solve it using the numbers, which goes back again to the neutrality. And then we also had, there was also an interesting paper that we read, which was on big data and algorithm modeling and consumer insights that was written by the American Academy of Actuaries. So I'll just read the statement as it is. So they say, open quotes, while human biases are based on preferences and socioeconomics have always been there, it is hoped that they can be it is hoped that by replacing human judgment with technology, the decision-making process can be more neutral. So that statement is actually, it's flawed. It's a flawed statement, right? Because it assumes that even the data that we have at hand actually is in some way very much neutral. It also assumes that when that data is collected, the questions that are asked or the rating factors that you choose to collect, it can give you a picture that is not biased, which is why I think, again, also this is evidence to how, as much as we haven't defined this term or conceptually engaged with it in our literature, but we actually seem to leave this neutrality thesis in the way that we do our work. And then there is a quote by a well-known mathematician that says, no object or algorithm is either good or evil in itself. It's how they are used that matters. Again, for me, it feels like this really summarizes the sentiment that we have as actuaries around the numbers. And I think it's also important to say that as you can hear, I'm drawing in terms of how we apply it. Because we just couldn't find where it was conceptually defended in terms of like, what is this neutrality? What does it mean? Even though we use it a lot, we apply it a lot in the work that we do.
So I think that is a good place to bridge into talking about these systems as technological artifacts. You know, in the US and I think around the world, people would say the gun is not the problem. You know, the artifact is not the problem, it's neutral. It's people that kill. You know, and there are people, philosophers of technology that argue that embedded in these tools are values, they are never neutral. So I will turn to Dr. Uga to really unpack, you know, is the gun neutral? Is it a neutral artifact? Is the breach a neutral artifact? Are algorithms a neutral artifact?
So, first of all, let's not just assume. I think when we use the word value, we always assume that the meaning is very, very prima facie, very clear. But the concept of value itself it's philosophically difficult concept to unpack. So first of all, the concept itself, value, it is understood, at least from philosophers of value like Richard Harre would say that value is conceptualized from a perspective of evaluation, which is evaluative good and deontic good. So by evaluation, it means when we speak about value from an evaluative terms, we want to evaluate either practices, concepts, or actions that are either good or bad. And then from a deontic perspective, then it's when we have unpacked a concept as good and bad, then we want to see what kind of duty do we owe towards, let's say, a particular kind of action. If an action is good, what duty do we owe to that action? Is the action right? Is it wrong? So here, the concept of good is somewhat different from the concept of right and wrong. But when it comes to philosophy, especially from the concept of value, for some reason, those two perspectives, the evaluative aspect of value and the deontic aspect of value, overlap. And it is in that you then understand the concept of neutrality. And by neutrality here, it means, can something be in the middle? Can you take a middle ground between either good or bad or right and wrong? And that is where the problem arises from. So when we bring it back now to the concept of technology to ask the question if technology is value neutral, we want to ask if technology is either good or bad. Or at least from a deontic perspective, is it right for us to use this technology for so-and-so action, or is it wrong for us to use this technology for so-and-so action? But then, before we even arrive at that, we want to also ask the question, does technology change the way we see the world? Yes, technology changes the way we see the world, how we engage with the world, at least according to how philosophers like Philip Bray and Don Ide will argue. It changes how the perspective in which we engage with the world. So now let us bring it back to the concept of technical artifacts. So technology that are not embedded within human, at least human society in terms of the social aspect or the social dynamic of human society. Then we want to talk about technical artifact, what people would say mere tools or just some artifact. Now the gun would be an example of a technical artifact. The reason why the gun would be an example of a technical artifact is that the gun does not act on its own. It doesn't have what it call, or what philosophers would say, it's not embedded with a semi-autonomous perspective. But it's almost easy for us to say that the gun is just a tool, and it depends on who uses the gun. But the gun itself cannot be implicit of whatever action that the user gets involved with. But that is not true. Why is that the case? It is because the gun changes the dynamics in which we can then engage with the concept of killing. So let us go back to the Stone Age. In the Stone Age, let us look at the technologies that existed within the Stone Age. And let's say people in, I don't know, let's use our imagination, 2,000 years ago, where there was no gun or there were no guns. The way in which they engage in the act of war is absolutely different from the way we engage with the act of war using guns. And that also involves with the new dynamics of warfare that we now have autonomous weapon system. The dynamics also change. Now, you could see that the action in terms of war engagement is changing because there is a tool. So, for instance, when we were using, let's say, spears and knives and axes, the distance in which I can kill a person would depend on so many factors. Do I want to get hurt while killing a person? Do I want to have blood stains while killing a person? And so on and so forth. But with a gun, I can just shoot you from afar and I would not incur all of these consequences. Now you could see that that dynamics has changed. And then let us look at the bridge, for instance. When you look at this bridge, it's just some artifacts that has like some road network that connects maybe two geographical entity that is demarcated by water. But then the bridge is also acting as something which then informs an act of discrimination. That is, what kinds of vehicles ought to pass through that bridge? Now, that is a valid question that we're asking, in the sense that, is it okay for a train to go through that bridge? Of course, no, it is not designed for a train. Now, that is a valid question. It's not just some random question. Or let us say, when we're driving past, let's say, the N1, N2, we would see those boards that say vehicles within this height are supposed to pass here, vehicles within this height are supposed to pass here. Now, those are just discriminatory intent in a sense that vehicles that do not fit into this road network ought not to pass here. And that you could see how that perspective of transportation movement is also changed. And let me bring another example that is not here, just to give a clear understanding of this concept. Let us look at, within the medical profession, an obstetric ultrasound, or let's say an ultrasound, let us call it an ultrasound. What is used to look at a pregnant woman, to know the fetuses, the health of the fetuses, and all of that. Now, from a perspective of technology being a tool, when one looks at an ultrasound, they would want to say that it is just a tool that allows us to look at a pregnant woman to know how the fetus is doing in terms of health implications. But let us assume that we looked at this fetus and we see that this fetus, when he is born or she's born or when they are born, they're going to have, let's say, Down syndrome. And let's say the parents of that child or the parents of that fetus don't want a child with Down syndrome. It follows that they would want to then advance the whole conversation of abortion. Now, you could see that the technology itself has resonated an ethical or a value problem, which is abortion. And abortion is a moral problem. But if we go back, if that technology wasn't designed in the first place, we wouldn't have had the issue of abortion in that case, because we wouldn't have been able to see how the fetus is doing inside the pregnant mother. And then, when we then come back now, these are all technologies that are just technical artifacts. Now, when we come back to socio-technical artifacts, what are the difference? So according to philosophers like Don Ide would say that a socio-technical artifact is an artifact that is designed out of 3 building blocks. So the first one is that the technology is designed with, let's say, a hardware. And this hardware is based on a certain preference, how we want the technology to look like, and so on and so forth. But also, it is designed from the perspective of semi-autonomy, in a sense that the technology can act on its own. Example that I've mentioned before, let us look at an autonomous weapon system. I think like 2 years ago, there was in the Middle Eastern country, America had sent one of the autonomous weapon system to go and execute someone within a high military general within the the Middle Eastern country. Now, you could see that that technology was within that parameters for about 3 months until it got the exact time to strike. Now, that technology was acting from a semi-autonomous perspective in the sense that it has been programmed and it could carry out certain actions without the interventions of somebody behind the technology, like a gun, where you have a human agent behind the technology. And so for Jeremy to then say that his technology is value neutral is that Jeremy lacks the understanding of what a technology is, what the concept of value is, what the concept of neutrality is, and what does technology as a socio-technical artifact implies.
And I guess embedded in such assumption, is sort of the neglect that every technology has some intended use. A gun is not just, a neutral thing. There is an intended use. There is a function that can be empirically verified. And Nontlantla, coming to you, sort of, you have done pricing and reserving. And Edmond or Dr. Oga has spoken about the place of values, in this artifact. What sort of values, do you work with when you are doing your work?
So I think depending on the role you are playing at that time as an actuary, I think if I look in my case where I've played both the role of as a pricing actuary and as a reserving actuary, in sense where I'm a pricing actuary working close, let's say, with business development teams, you'd find that you usually find yourself optimizing for is accuracy and also profits as we work for profit organization. Because you don't want to be overly conservative and end up not selling, right? While when you are reserving, you tend to take a more conservative approach because you want to ensure that the amount that is set aside is enough to cover claims. And already there you can see how two actuaries, whether it's a pricing or a reserving actuary, even though you would give them the same data and they're in the same context, but because they are optimizing for different values, they're actually going to give you different answers. So that's when the value comes in. And then if I were to bring it back to Jeremy is given data. And as we know, medical schemes have been struggling with fraud, waste, and abuse. And it even goes, I think, even beyond our borders, even if we look at some of us who've worked outside of the South African space, that even other countries are struggling with fraud, waste, and abuse in the healthcare environment. So what he had to do, or the value that he was prioritizing, is that I need to actually clamp down on fraud, waste, and abuse. So in the way that this algorithm was built, it was built with that he had to optimize the fraud, waste, and abuse and ensure that he minimizes the impact of fraud, waste, and abuse in his model. And that was the value that he optimized. Which is why, again, if as much as this, we've separated Jeremy from Section 59. But if, again, you look at, if you followed Section 9 very closely about how when you hear the Black healthcare providers testifying about their experiences, that actually they've been saying for years that these models have been targeting them disproportionately. But they were dismissed, ignored. And that has to do with that, again, what was being prioritized at that time was to actually reduce fraud, waste, and abuse. And I think for me, the danger, especially, which is why it's very important that we challenge this assumption of neutrality, because we don't want to put ourselves in a situation where we're so confident in our modeling that we actually ignore people's experiences, because people's experiences are real. If someone says something is not right with the model, we should be able to sit down and say, maybe there is, let's sit down and discuss. And I think if we look at the case of Section 59 from a lens of morality and also just respecting and recognizing people's experiences and actually acting on them, it's that part where what was really being prioritized at that point in time.
So I want to move us along. Just looking at the time now. This slide attempts to sort of summarize the key points that we have made so far. That algorithms are not neutral because they inherit the values of their creators, and the choice of what to optimize for is already a value judgment. The kind of data that you collect, the questions that you asked, how you frame that enterprise is already a value enterprise. So to pretend otherwise, I think it's not true. And again, in the paper, we dispel this distinction between cooked and raw data. Cooked data being that data that has been analyzed, falsified, and the raw data is data that is not analyzed. And we say, the processes and the practice of even the data production is already cooked. So that distinction falls apart. That, this is just data. That the process of collecting that already makes that process cooked. If we don't pay attention to these things, we can amplify existing societal biases. So let's go now to the second argument of redefining objectivity. Remember, Jeremy offers that he followed an objective process. And again, like we did with trying to find sustained conceptual defense to the epistemic concept of neutrality, we did the same for objectivity. In the Code of Conduct, I think it has appeared at least 5 times. And in other publications, there's always an invitation to be objective. But again, we struggle to find, a definition of what objectivity means. But in looking at various practices and various documents, we could tease out at least 3 conceptions of objectivity. The first conception is objectivity as being faithful to facts, and fact is what is out there in the world. The second one is, to be free from values, and the third one is to be free from bias. And I'll turn to Tlantla to sort of tell us about the process of how we got to these 3 conceptions and how they feature in the actuarial literature.
Okay. So in terms of objectivity, again, it's used quite a bit in our literature, in our code of conduct, in our guidelines. You find objectivity a lot. But again, it got into an issue where I think when you asked me what it is exactly, I really couldn't define it. I could say how it's applied, but I really couldn't define it. So then what we did is we look at these 3 conceptions of objectivity, which is the first one being faithful to facts, the second one, freedom from values, and the third one, freedom from bias. Then what we do, we went back to the basics, which for me is the actuarial control cycle, to understand how is it interpreted within the actuarial control cycle. Then when we looked at defining the problem phase of the actuarial control cycle, actually we say that we should proceed from available facts out there, outside of us. And then we talk about analyzing the stakeholders again, almost like putting the stakeholder out there and yourself separate from the stakeholder, almost like being able to have this nice full view of the stakeholder and analyzing them and the risks that come with it, and yourself being the separate party who's so objective and sitting from the outside. That's how we saw it being defined in the defining the problem stage of the actuarial control cycle. Then the second one, it showed up in the developing the solution phase, where we say that assumptions have to be grounded on observed experience. So that tied in with that definition of objectivity. And then the third one was on the freedom from bias, where it showed up in the phase where you're supposed to make your assumptions visible. Where, like as we all know, when you work on your actuarial document, you always need to ensure that you are clear what assumptions went into your modeling. Again, that spoke into the 3 conception of the objectivity. And again, as you can see, as we are showing that actually objectivity as we use it, actually we were able to find 3 definitions where it could fit in. So then, which raises the question of ambiguity in terms of our actuarial material or our code of conduct, where it's mentioned many times but not defined. Then we went to the ASA code of conduct, the 2015 one, and then we looked at where it's used. Like for example, in paragraph 13, we say differences must be conducted objectively, and then in paragraph 16, we say differences must be conducted objectively. Then you go to paragraph 17 where it says where conflict arises when members' interests may influence the objective performance. Again, we debated this and actually said, we could link all these into the different 3 definitions, which means the very code of conduct where we base our all our work. Oh, sorry, I see that one of our phones are distracting. Thank you. So as you can see, that as much as the objectivity term is used multiple times in our code of conduct, but it's never defined. And just looking at it with the data that we have, the literature that we had, we could actually fit it into the 3 different definitions, which then leads into this ambiguity, which is ambiguity we shouldn't have for such an important term in our profession. And then also, then it begs the question, then how are we going to hold each other accountable? Let's say, for instance, in a disciplinary process, just making an example, how are we going to hold each other accountable if we didn't define even the very important term like neutrality and objectivity? So that's how it showed up. Then we also went into other literature outside. For example, with the International Actuarial Association, they delivered, I think it was a speech in 2014, where they said that, which again we tied it into the first definition, which is faithful to facts, where they said that the critical element of problem definition phase is grounding it on data and truth. Again, this goes back to this assumption that the data can actually be completely not biased, or there's something called the truth, or the data that is so complete, so neutral, so not biased, which again is an assumption that is quite flawed.
I think, what became sort of clearer is that again and again, these epistemic sort of concepts are employed, truth, objectivity, neutrality, yet it's difficult to really see how they are defended or argued for. And we have made an offer in our paper, which is an invitation for us to think about objectivity from the standpoint epistemology point of view. Standpoint epistemology is basically the view that all knowledge is irreducibly social. There is no fact that is out there that is objective. What we see is colored by our positionality, by our power, by our access. So the facts out there and the inquirer being separate, social epistemologists argue against that. And their argument is essentially that objectivity is strengthened by starting your inquiry from the position of the most marginalized. So if you can take that point of view and then begin to inquire into the world, then you would see other things. There is this picture that I really love, and it spoke to what you said earlier. So there is this rhino. He's trying to paint the view out there in the world. One could say, his or her hand is distorting reality. But as you can, a fair expectation is not for the rhino to cut off her hand. That is who he is or she is or they are. So how do we acknowledge our own stuff in this inquiry? How do we come in with the data awareness and allow intersubjectivity? Epistemologists talk about intersubjectivity, allowing other people to challenge your point of view, to minimize bias, rather than thinking that, you can just be true to facts, and the facts are, untainted. So, I think, maybe before I go to the implications of this argument, Edmund, you have done a lot of work thinking about John Rawls and his theory of justice, in your research. Can you tell us about, how John Rawls defends the difference principle?
So Rawls is one of the greatest political philosopher of our time, especially of the 20th and 21st century. And in his book on a theory of justice, he provides an account of justice that is one of the most celebrated account of justice in the liberal tradition. But it's just that account of justice is not just important to any liberal society. Fortunately, South Africa happens to be a liberal society, which means South Africa can adapt through Rawls' theory of justice. And also with what he presents in the book, A Theory of Justice and Political Liberalism, there's quite a lot, or there are quite a lot of things that we can learn from his theory. Now, at the center of his book, in A Theory of Justice, is the difference principle. So what does he argue, or what does the difference principle mean? He would say that justice ought to be fair. So justice is fairness. But where fairness, sometimes the notion of discrimination can be included in the concept of fairness. But this notion of discrimination ought to come from the least advantage. So when there is redistribution of political goods or of social goods, those that ought to be prioritized would be those that are least advantaged in society. So if we look at the context of South Africa, I'm not going to answer the question, but who are those that are least advantaged? And that is where the perspective of fairness or justice as fairness ought to arise from. So from the least advantaged to those who are advantaged. And he paints this picture, and I think I'd do justice to it if I mention it. So in his case study, or in his hypothetical case scenario, for him to establish why justice ought to come from the least advantage, or why fairness ought to be based on the least advantage, he would say that let us imagine a society where all of us seated in this room, we've all come together to make decisions on how society ought to be progressive, or how society needs to progress from now. And coming into this context, we don't know who we really are. The only thing that we know about ourselves is that we're rational beings. It means that we have capability for reason and capability for reasonable decisions. So you don't know that you're black, you don't know that you're white, you don't know that you're a woman, you don't know that you're he, she, they, you don't know any of that. You only know that you're capable of making rational decisions. What kind of principles, not just principles, what kinds of measures do you think you would put in society on the grounds that after that veil of ignorance, which he calls it, you wouldn't know who you are? So let's say if you leave the veil of ignorance, only then would you know what you are, what kind of identity you hold. But within the veil of ignorance, you don't know your identity. He argues that we would make decisions that would ensure the betterment of us on the grounds that we don't know who or whatever identity that we hold. We don't know if we're rich or poor or whatever. So if we look at that concept, you could see how that then applies to the case of Jeremy, who designs his model from a neutral perspective. And according to how Academore has already spelled out, from a standpoint epistemological perspective, what then was Jeremy supposed to do? Of course, Jeremy was supposed to begin his design from the least advantage, putting the least advantage within the parameters of his design. Or at least that should be his point of departure, or their point of departure, rather than the other way. And I think Nonhlanhla has already spelled out the whole business of data. It is then that he's supposed to then engage with the data and see where is the data coming from, where is he sourcing the data from, and how has the data been optimized in order to capture those who are least advantaged.
Yeah. Thanks, Dr. Oga. And Nonhlanhla, bring this home for us. What would these arguments mean for the actuarial profession?
So I think for the profession, I think it'll be very not fair to basically say this is a call for an individual actuary. It's more of a call for us as a collective. So there's a lot of great literature or methodologies around how we can mitigate against proxy discrimination. But on our side, we are arguing from a different point of view. We are saying we are actually claiming that there's no such thing as a neutrality, there's no such thing as objectivity in its sense as how we actually apply it. And we say, if then that is the case and you accept that argument, then we are arguing for justice as fair discrimination, where we consider our own context and say our fairness as a society will actually be grounded from justice, especially considering the context of South Africa. And that very much ties in with the public interest. As much as, yes, I do appreciate that there is no one yet a definition for public interest, but what we're calling the actuarial society to do is actually to broaden how we apply or interpret public interest to include justice. And then if I go to the first point about the values being fundamental to every technology, including the work that we do as actuaries, then we are arguing that as a value, one of the key values we should always incorporate is actually justice. And I do appreciate that there is quite a complex thing to do, especially if you are working in the context of an organization that may be prioritizing profits, where that's what you're prioritizing, where sometimes it's in conflict with justice. But we are actuaries that we claim that in our work, it's actually we center public interest. If that's the case, you accept that. Then we're just asking that let's just take it further and as public interest include justice. And then if I tie that back in with Jeremy, right, in terms of where we are, given the South African context, I would like to broaden the question, because I know because this paper was inspired by Section 59, which was focusing on black providers. But I want to broaden the question to be not only about the race, but I want to broaden the question to say, do we want to be a society that is going to build models that are technically sound, statistically or actually correct, but actually that results in us discriminating by race, discriminating by gender, or discriminating those who are living with disability? Because we all know that there tends to be a cohort of population that is not represented well in the data. And we can only really be confident that we're not being biased against them if we can actually collect data for the whole population, which is not possible for now. So that's why we are arguing on our side, as much as we acknowledge all the methodologies, all the work that is being done to actually help this problem of proxy discrimination. But we are saying, no, for now, while we're in a position where we can't collect everything, we can't collect all the data, we're actually saying, let's just include justice in our public interest. And we are arguing for that kind of objectivity.
So I see we are running out of time. I'll try and conclude this in 2 minutes by just signaling to the third defense that Jeremy offered, in a way he said he didn't intend to cause harm. And in the ethics of harm, there are 3 ways one could do harm. One is, where there's a failure of intention. Think about a pregnant woman who takes dangerous, maybe substances like cocaine, and harms the fetus. In that case, that woman is doing harm. You could also allow harm if I want to use the gun that Dr. Uga, showed us, and I have means to prevent that, to stop that, and then I sort of allow it to happen. Then I'm allowing harm, and I think it's another ground for moral responsibility. And I could also ignore harm, and this is where Jeremy, sort of fell into. He ignored the harmed and the sort of biases that are embedded in his society, and sort of philosophers talk about willful blindness to harm, willful ignorance. And it arises from failure of moral attention. And when the system causes harm, is the argument I didn't know enough. So Dr. Uga, very briefly, maybe in just a minute, when can we say that ignorance is grounds for culpability?
Okay, I think to answer that question, in 30 seconds, I would use an example. So let us say that there is a medical professional, a medical doctor, who is treating a patient. Let us call that patient Nosipo. So Nosipo comes into the practice, and the medical professional is supposed to, let's say, treat appendix or something. And let's say he goes and then he conducts or she conducts the treatment and carry out the treatment. But then Nosipo then maybe died in the process. Now, the question would be, is the medical professional culpable for that? Now, we want to go back and say, did the medical professional check Nosipo's file to see if she had other conditions that could have jeopardized the surgery? Now, in that case, if the medical practitioner did not do that, then the medical practitioner is culpable for that harm. But should the medical practitioner had done all of those checks, and let's say before Nosipo came into the hospital, she had gone by the counter and taken a pill, and that pill then jeopardized, without informing the medical practitioner, it jeopardized the surgery. In that case, the medical practitioner would not be culpable for that harm because he or she out there did all that they were supposed to do. Now, if we bring it back to the case of Jeremy, we want to ask the question, did Jeremy then go towards those who are least advantaged, those who are not equally represented in the data set? If Jeremy had done all of that and then he had a failed model, then Jeremy wouldn't have been held culpable. But if Jeremy did not do any of that or did not employ, let's say, the expertise of ethicists during the design, the expertise of policymakers during the designs, and the expertise of those who carry out regulations around technology during the design, in cases like that, we can hold Jeremy culpable for that action, and he's morally responsible.
Thank you, Dr. Uga. And this is the last bit of our presentation, and I will hand it to Ntlantla to sort of bring it home for us. What does this mean for responsible practice?
Yeah, I think given that time, I will just leave us with an example for me that will summarize. I think if I was an actuary, I'll just make an example using COVID-19 that affected us either directly or indirectly in some way. If I'm an actuary being asked to price in some world, as we say, is a country of actuaria. If I was asked to price for that and there was no regulation on what I could price at, and my model produces that healthcare providers who was at the forefront actually helping us through COVID-19, if the statistical or actual model that I'm using disputes that I should charge them significantly way more premium in a way that they cannot even afford it, I want to be that actuary that's going to push back and say, no, that is just not right. I think that's how I would summarize this basically the call of a responsible practice, where I say we go beyond the numbers and ask ourselves what is actually morally right.
And it's essentially a call to move beyond neutrality towards a practice that is technically excellent. We don't want to undermine that, but also, attend to a moral accountability. So we leave you with this question, and I guess it's an invitation for you to answer. When a system causes harm, is I didn't know enough. Can we let Jeremy off the hook, given his sort of culpable ignorance in developing the model that he developed? Thank you very much, and we will take some questions. We might not be able to offer a sustained answer.
Lots of questions, oh my word. Okay, we're going to try and take them 2 at a time, if that's okay. And then if there are any other questions that we don't get to, then they can approach. But let's try to take 2 at a time. So let's start with the gentleman here and the guy next to him. And then we'll work it that way. I see you. So you can go, sir.
Thanks. I think it's great that we talking about these things. I think these things are very important. We had a short-term insurance sessional very recently that tried to talk about fair price discrimination. And I think one of the things that the authors did was took some of the content from the American sort of researchers, because they've also been doing on this. And I think unintentionally, one of the sort of outcomes or the reasoning behind it was that race is a rating factor, which is quite a disturbing sort of conclusion in that fair price discrimination, because what it's actually saying is that black and Indian people are worse drivers or inherently worse. So that fair price discrimination talk I don't think went very well, because I think it just had some underlying biases, like literally racial biases in that. I mean, one of the things that needed to be unpacked is, why are we saying race is a factor? Is it, related to income? Is it related, to whether you had a fatherly figure at home, whether you're orphaned, whether, there's a whole lot of factors that go behind race in South Africa. And those are the true rating factors, that comes out of it. So I just think it's amazing that we are on a far more advanced level of debate than the American society. I mean, for them, it's obvious race is a factor. Models inherently charge rates higher for black and Hispanic people because they're inherently bad, and that's the conclusion in American society, which is extremely horrible. And it's great that we as South Africans have a very mature mindset about that, obviously because we've probably had a pass in that. Okay, so I don't want to labor that point. I just want to just make that point. But my real question is, where do we take this to? So yes, I agree on race, but I mean, there's a debate that age can't be changed. Height and weight is not very easy to change. Gender, marital status, there's a whole lot of factors that, you can probably, defraud the system, but it's generally quite hard to change some of those factors. So when we start talking about neutrality, is it that any factor that we can't change easily, is a bias factor and shouldn't be used in any of the, and then goes to maybe a BMI is not appropriate. All of these underlying factors that we used in life insurance, short-term insurance, all of this, comes up for question because why only race? Why isn't age, a factor? So my point is that it's great that they're having this debate, but let's not stop at race if we really want to be true and to this, there's a whole lot of other factors, and the theory behind is if you can change the factor, that's a factor we can probably rate on. If you inherently find it difficult to change that factor, like age, gender, merit, et cetera, it's probably not model neutral or what the terminology you said, to actually do that. Thanks.
Thanks very much. Matthew Zolstra from Discovery Health. I was a little horrified to see actuarial models being compared to a gun. I really don't believe that we point guns at people with actuarial models. I prefer to think of actuarial models as babies, that you train and you teach and you grow and you nurture. And that process requires data to train them on. And I think that's the issue where the bias comes in, because data is not pure, it's not clean, it's generated by people. And so the important thing is to understand the potential for bias in the data, understand the process generation, that happens with that, and how involved was a person. So for me, Jeremy's got a number of conundrums. And the conundrums being, one of them being, if he doesn't have race data, how will he ever be able to test his model whether it is fairly discriminating against race? So that's the first one. Second one is now he wants to collect race data. Obviously, there's a big question about why do you want race data now if it's not an underwriting factor? Why are you collecting this now? He wants to debias his model because potentially the data has got this bias in it. Another conundrum is a lot of the data comes from people's tip-offs. It's not machine-generated data, it's from people. Now, that could be heavily biased data. How does he account for that bias in that data that actually comes from other people tipping off, the fact that some doctors are behaving fraudulently? And then I think there's a number of I wouldn't want to be Jeremy in this case because there's so many issues here. And I suppose the last one is the ground truth. In a particular year, there could be a particular race group that is overrepresented in terms of fraud versus not fraud, just randomly, And the question is, if that is the ground truth and his model picks up that ground truth, does he ignore that because that particular race group is a marginalized minority group? Or does he focus on testing the model further to see, is he discriminating unfairly, or is he actually picking up something that does exist in that particular year for that particular race group? So those are some of the kind of conundrums that I think Jeremy has to deal with, and they're not easy ones. They're not as easy as just dismissing the entire model, but there are things that we definitely need to think about and need to make sure that we don't let any unfair bias into our models, which I do believe are quite good and quite neutral as a start. I think it's the data that comes from humans that can lead to the biases, and we just need to protect against that.
Okay, cool. So let's get a response for Riyadh, who's in the front, and then we can see if we can get a microphone for that lady, and it will take another question, so we can have two at a time. So who wants to respond to Riyadh, and then we'll get to you.
No, thank you for those questions. I would like to just address the question around the power of our models. There's a book, I just can't remember its title. It's a really good book. I think it's Numbers of Mass Destruction. Basically, which puts it very real, I think, for us who work with numbers, the power of the numbers or the models, because basically it put it for me into perspective in terms of the power of our models and the impacts that it has on real people. I think one of the examples in the book was on policing in America, how the police were using an algorithm that was created in terms of to see which communities they should target. But unfortunately, because of the data was tainted already, because as we know, because of the history of America, already the blacks were usually quite over-policed. So of course, the algorithm will actually point you to the black communities. And actually that has really impact to that community, because all of a sudden you have a community of people with criminal records because they are being over-policed. And then you have people who are sitting in, I would say, posh communities who are not policed, who can get away with quite a lot. So I think I would like to challenge us to say, to actually really appreciate the impact that the numbers have. And also if I think about Section 59, some of the testimonies is actually I think there were some doctors who actually had to close their practice because they just couldn't afford to pay back the medical schemes of the money that they were being accused to have, to be owing the schemes because of the fraud, waste, and abuse accusations. Again, for me, that's a real example of how what is just seems like a simple algorithm or a model actually really has a real impact on someone's livelihood.
Hi. Thanks, the panel for the paper. I read it. Actually, when I saw the title, I was leaning towards no, sticking to our models. The models work, and we trust the data. But I was actually quite challenged by your arguments and how you brought in the different theories and bring in Jeremy. So thank you for that. It was a very well-written paper. But my question, I know you mentioned this in your paper. It says, we argue for a version of objectivity that centers values which advance the interests of the marginalized groups. So then from a business perspective, right, you still have your shareholders who still need profit, right? We work for mainly for-profit organizations. So then how do us as actuaries practically apply this, right? Because we still need to make sure that the insurance company doesn't go bust, and we have insurance companies that are still, we have to have a solution that's sustainable, right, for both parties, for the marginalized groups and society as a whole, but also from the business perspective and the sustainability of insurance companies, because insurance companies are there for the people, to cover, for example, to cover for the people for something bad that's happening, right? So then that is also needed in society, and those still need to be around for a couple of years' time. So that's my question from the business perspective. And also, doesn't this introduce more actuarial judgment in the process? And how do we tackle that as a profession? Thanks.
Okay, we've got that, and then we can get a microphone to the lady behind you. If there are any questions that we don't get to, please approach the panelists individually, if I can ask that. It's just in the interest of time, I'm trying to get you to your next item.
Thank you. I'll be quick. I'm Philippa Wild, Bright Insurance. Thank you. That was very thought-provoking. I really empathize with Jeremy. I wanted to interrupt you the whole way through to argue cases this way and that. But I've landed on guidance, thinking of the ASA guidance notes, and how do we help young professionals in the business, ourselves as well, to actually deal with these kind of things? Because the question of, if you don't know, I didn't know, is that good enough? So what am I supposed to know? What am I supposed to go and investigate more of? So I think that's a nice challenge for the Actuarial Society. Please don't give me the job, but yeah, I think I'll happily help. Thanks.
Okay, let's get responses. Do you want to respond, anyone?
Thank you very much for the questions. Firstly, we don't want to oversimplify this issue. It's not something that is oversimplified. And just to correct, we weren't comparing guns to models. We were just trying to understand the concept of technology and its value-ladenness. I think one of the important things that Actuarial Society, especially in their training, ought to put into consideration is the expansion of business ethics and the expansion of the whole notion of ethics. Because this is an ethical issue. At the center of profitability, there ought to be morality as well. And and I think maybe that's why I don't think actuarial society will want us as philosophers, because we'll come and police you to saying that we understand that you're trying to maximize profit, but at the same time, it shouldn't be to the detriment of the human person as a moral agent or as an agent that has the capacity for autonomous decision making, the capacity for community in the case of the sub-Saharan African morality, and so on. So for young actuaries, for young professionals, I would want to say that as a society, you guys, the actuaries, need to police most of the universities that your young professionals are coming from to take the ethics part seriously. I think that is my advice. From the actuary perspective, what would you say?
I think to add from what you said, I agree. But I just wanted to add that these issues, that's why I think when I said in terms of call for objectivity, I said it's a collective call, not an individual call. And because I think we need to recognize as actuaries the place of privilege that we are in. We usually get to be invited to contribute. And I think in this case, that's where we can play a part, right? And I would also like to link it to the gentleman's question in front in terms of how far do we take it with these rating factors if one can change it? I think that's when we need to actually be in healthy debates and debate it out. And that's going to change over time, right? Because these things move with times. If you remember, I think from what we covered in our ethics education. And I think just to go back to your question, I think on the profitability, we do operate in an environment where the organizations are for profit. And I think that's the reality of things, right? And it tends to drive in terms of how we behave and what our models prioritize. But again, it goes back to that as a society, we do have the power to actually influence these things. If we start debating more on the morality beyond the numbers, all of a sudden we can be able to both influence the law and also influence our organization in terms of how they look at these issues. And then if I would like to just put another example, it's actually something that happened during lunch while we were getting lunch, right? Was it around 1? So the lady in front of us was basically talking about the session she was in on mental health, in terms of how actually some of these mental health issues are being driven by our very organizations. And I actually challenge it to say, actually, there is a systems issue because your manager is busy emailing you at 11 because they need to make sure that their client is retained. Because at the end of the day, we need to report a good financial position, right? And again, those are the things we need to every time pause and say, actually, let's challenge the morality of it. Because then as much as, yes, you're busy optimizing for profit, but at what expense, right? Because at the end of the day, we're humans. Right, and we have morals, we have values that we live by, and is it aligned? I think it just requires a little bit of pause, and for us to have those healthy debates and have those difficult conversations. And then for me, there was a paper that was written a couple of years back. I think it was by Marius in terms of just assessing or reevaluating the kind of ethical education that we have. And I think now probably it's the time to really maybe go back and rethink that. Do we have enough tools as actuaries to actually be able to navigate these ethical conundrums and maybe relook at that and see, okay, maybe we need to relook at our education to see what can we add, what can we take out so that we can be able to navigate with this complexity. And the complexity is just it's not going to get easy, it's going to get harder because now we are using advanced algorithms, AI. We're going to get into these situations even more often, which means we need to relook at our toolbox, especially the ethical toolbox.
And in summary, our call is really simple. There are no easy answers. There are no easy answers. We are inviting everyone, let's go beyond the numbers, which is I think is the theme of this year's convention. Let's go beyond the data, let's put people, let's put the planet at the center of our work. That is really the invitation. And from there, we can begin to think about, okay, what does this mean in terms of modeling and the tools and frameworks that we use? But what is our philosophical commitment? What are the values that we want to center? And we are putting forward that we should center justice, equity, and redress. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay, let's give them a round of applause. With that said, if you want to talk with them a little further, they are in the room. Just a quick announcement. Obviously, we're going into our refreshment break right now. It's by Communicate Recruitment, but we're all going to meet back into the main plenary session. I do hope you're going to stick around for Laugh and Linger Longer a little bit later on, which is at 6.
Yes, and there's an inside chess tournament at the moment if you want to catch that. Thanks.